Congress, as you know, has provided a number of authorities to the president to levy such tariffs, but the International Emergency Economic Powers Act is not one of them. I believe the IEEPA tariffs are illegal and unconstitutional, and I'm hoping the Supreme Court will overturn the president's decision. Additionally, the cost to consumers from this administration's trade wars cannot be ignored. Families are paying higher prices for everyday necessities, from groceries to clothing to home goods, because of the Trump tariffs. President Trump acknowledged this risk himself months ago when he said, well, American kids might have to have $2 instead of $30. I don't know what family, other than the Trump family and some others, can provide $30 to their kids, but that was an admission by the president of the impact on cost of those policies. And of course, just last month, as part of an effort to reduce prices, the administration—
You just watched Senator Van Hollen systematically dismantle the legal and moral architecture undergirding Trump's brazen power grab through tariff policy. And we need to talk about what this actually means, because this is not some dry procedural debate about statutory interpretation or administrative law nuances. This is nothing less than the defining constitutional crisis of our generation unfolding in real time, with the Supreme Court poised to decide whether American democracy will maintain any semblance of separation of powers, or whether we're about to witness the final collapse into authoritarian executive rule, wrapped in the shallow rhetoric of economic nationalism. The senator just delivered something extraordinary because he named the fraud at the heart of Trump's entire project with surgical precision, calling these tariffs what they legally are, which is illegal and unconstitutional, and then he connected that constitutional violation directly to its material consequences in the lives of working families, who are getting absolutely crushed by price increases on everything from groceries to clothing to home goods. And what you're about to hear is why this matters far beyond trade policy, because the court's decision could shape whether the use of emergency powers to bypass Congress becomes a tool of routine governance, with profound implications for the constitutional separation of powers and limits on presidential authority. Let me tell you what's happening here, because the stakes are almost incomprehensibly vast, and yet the mainstream discourse keeps treating this like some technical dispute about tariff authority, when what we're actually witnessing is the potential legitimization of presidential dictatorship through the manipulation of emergency powers. Using an emergency declaration to impose tariffs is a clear abuse of presidential emergency powers, and this isn't hyperbole from partisan Democrats. This is the conclusion reached by the divided appeals court, which split 7-4. Many even Trump-appointed judges looked at this scheme and said no, this violates the fundamental constitutional allocation of powers. The Brennan Center has documented that no president has ever used this law to impose tariffs before, making Trump's invocation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act a genuinely unprecedented expansion of executive authority into territory that the Constitution explicitly and unambiguously reserves for Congress. And here's where the intellectual dishonesty of this entire enterprise becomes crystal clear, because by no stretch of the imagination can long-standing trade relationships be considered an unforeseen emergency. Think about what Trump is actually claiming here, because the audacity is breathtaking in its contempt for constitutional governance. He's declaring that trade deficits that have existed for decades, that have been the subject of endless congressional debate and legislation, that have been addressed through multiple trade agreements ratified by the legislative branch, suddenly constitute an emergency so dire that he can unilaterally impose the largest tax increase on American consumers since the Great Depression without a single vote from Congress. This is the same playbook that authoritarians have used throughout history to concentrate power, manufacturing crises to justify the assumption of extraordinary authorities that then become normalized and permanent. And what Van Hollen understood and articulated is that this isn't just bad trade policy, this is a frontal assault on the Constitution itself. The statute bestows significant authority on the president to undertake a number of actions in response to a declared national emergency, but none of these actions explicitly include the power to impose tariffs, duties, or the like, or the power to tax, and that word tax is absolutely critical here, because what Trump has done is seize the power of taxation, which since the American Revolution has been understood as the most fundamental power of representative government, the very reason we fought a war of independence in the first place. Now let's talk about the material reality that Van Hollen connected to this constitutional crisis, because this is where progressive analysis becomes absolutely essential in piercing through the obfuscation and lies that Trump and his enablers have used to justify this catastrophic policy. The tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,000 per U.S. household in 2025, And that's a deeply regressive tax that falls hardest on working families who spend the highest proportion of their income on basic necessities. When Van Hollen quoted Trump's grotesque comment about kids getting $2 bills instead of $30 bills as allowance, he was highlighting the obscene class dimension of this entire debacle, the casual cruelty of a billionaire president who literally cannot conceive of families for whom $30 represents a meaningful financial burden, who thinks that kind of comment is somehow charming or relatable, when it actually reveals the yawning chasm between his lived experience and the economic reality facing the vast majority of Americans. Trump's wide-ranging tariffs will cost businesses in the U.S. an additional $1.2 trillion this year, with consumers shouldering most of those costs, and we're seeing this manifest in concrete price increases across virtually every category of consumer goods. The evidence of price impacts is already overwhelming and getting worse with each passing month, because tariffs don't just disappear. They work their way through supply chains and eventually land on families struggling to afford basic necessities. Inflation has picked up since President Donald Trump announced new import tariffs in April, with the latest Consumer Price Index data showing outsized increases in tariff-sensitive categories, including coffee, toys, and televisions. And these aren't luxury goods we're talking about. These are the fundamental building blocks of middle-class life. Prices climbed 4.9% from April through August, equivalent to an annualized pace of about 15%, just for bananas, a staple food that has been synonymous with price stability for generations, and now even that baseline affordability is being stripped away by Trump's reckless economic nationalism. Coffee prices have surged, clothing prices are climbing, furniture costs are skyrocketing, and all of this is hitting hardest the families who were already living paycheck to paycheck, who were already making impossible choices between groceries and rent, who were already being crushed by decades of wage stagnation and the systematic dismantling of the social safety net. What makes this even more infuriating is that Trump and his propagandists continue to lie brazenly about who actually pays these tariffs, claiming that somehow foreign countries are bearing the burden, when literally every economist and every piece of empirical data demonstrates that U.S. businesses have absorbed most of the tariff costs through July 2025, not foreign sellers, and those businesses are now passing those costs on to American consumers. The intellectual dishonesty here is staggering, because Trump knows he's lying. His advisors know he's lying, and yet they continue to repeat this fiction, that tariffs are somehow making other countries pay for American priorities, when the reality is that tariffs are a tax on American importers that gets passed through to American consumers in the form of higher prices. Van Hollen called this out explicitly when he noted that families are paying higher prices for everyday necessities from groceries to clothing to home goods because of Trump tariffs, and then he highlighted Trump's own admission that prices would rise, an admission Trump made, and then immediately tried to dismiss with that tone-deaf comment about kids' allowances that revealed just how disconnected this administration is from economic reality for working families. But here's where we need to zoom out and understand the broader historical and philosophical context, because what Trump is doing isn't just bad policy. It represents the resurgence of a deeply reactionary form of economic nationalism that has repeatedly led to catastrophic outcomes throughout modern history. The return of U.S. President Donald Trump has ushered in a new era of economic nationalism and transactional diplomacy, rattling global markets and destabilizing long-standing trade norms, and this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is part of a global authoritarian turn that threatens the entire post-World War II international order that was built precisely to prevent the kind of beggar-thy-neighbor policies that characterized the 1930s and contributed to the conditions that made fascism possible. The historical echoes here should terrify anyone who understands how economic instability and nationalist resentment can metastasize into something far darker, and yet we're watching in real time as Trump embraces policies that economists and historians have identified as profoundly dangerous, not just economically but geopolitically. The legal architecture that Trump is exploiting and perverting was never intended to give the president unlimited discretion to remake American trade policy through executive fiat, and multiple courts have now recognized this fundamental overreach. It falls squarely within the Supreme Court's notion of a novel use of an unheralded power, given that no other president has used IEEPA in its nearly 50-year history to impose tariffs, and that novelty should immediately trigger the Supreme Court's major questions doctrine, which requires clear congressional authorization for executive actions of vast economic and political significance. The taxes are estimated to generate $3 trillion over 10 years, which is an absolutely staggering sum that dwarfs even the student loan forgiveness program that this same conservative Supreme Court struck down as exceeding executive authority. The hypocrisy is laid bare when you realize that the court found student debt relief that would have helped millions of working families to exceed presidential authority, while potentially blessing tariffs that amount to a massive regressive tax increase imposed without any congressional authorization whatsoever. Let's be extremely clear about what the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was actually designed to do, because context matters enormously when we're talking about statutory interpretation and presidential authority. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was passed to enable the president to impose economic sanctions on hostile foreign actors, things like freezing assets of terrorist organizations or preventing financial transactions with rogue regimes engaged in nuclear proliferation. It was never ever intended as a backdoor mechanism for the president to unilaterally restructure the entire American trading system and impose trillions of dollars in new taxes on American businesses and consumers. The statute's legislative history makes this abundantly clear, and legislative history indicates that emergencies are by their nature rare and brief, and are not to be equated with normal, ongoing problems. Yet Trump has declared emergencies based on trade deficits that have existed for literally decades, and fentanyl trafficking patterns that have been ongoing policy challenges addressed through normal legislative processes. This is textbook pretextual use of emergency powers, where the declared emergency is transparently not the real motivation, and the actions taken bear no reasonable relationship to addressing the supposed crisis. Multiple amici briefs filed in the Supreme Court case have documented the pretextual nature of these emergency declarations with devastating precision, and the evidence is absolutely damning when you look at the administration's own statements and the complete disconnect between the declared emergencies and the actions taken. Former national security officials have pointed out that U.S. Customs and Border Protection statistics show that 80% of all individuals arrested bringing fentanyl into the United States across the southwest border are not Canadian, Chinese, or Mexican nationals, but rather U.S. It completely undermines the supposed justification for trafficking tariffs on those countries. The claim that Canada represents a major source of fentanyl is particularly absurd given that the U.S. government's own statistics show only 0.2% of the fentanyl arriving at the U.S. border came from Canada in 2024, yet Trump imposed massive tariffs on our closest trading partner and ally based on this manufactured emergency. This isn't policy analysis, this is propaganda, and the courts need to call it what it is. What Van Hollen articulated, and what progressives need to be screaming from the rooftops, is that this case represents nothing less than a final showdown over whether we will maintain meaningful constraints on presidential power, or whether we're going to normalize the president's ability to declare emergencies whenever Congress won't give him what he wants, and then use those manufactured emergencies to assume legislative powers that the Constitution explicitly denies him. If the court upholds Trump's use of IEEPA for tariffs, it could cement a broad precedent for governing by emergency stral, and think about what that means for every future administration, because once this Pandora's box is opened, it doesn't get closed again. Future presidents could claim non-existent emergencies to act unilaterally on any number of issues, from climate policy to technology regulation. And suddenly the entire notion of separation of powers becomes a dead letter, a quaint historical artifact that we abandoned because the Supreme Court was unwilling to constrain executive overreach when it came from a president they ideologically supported. The separation of powers argument here is absolutely foundational to understanding why progressives should be mobilized in fury over this case, because what's at stake is the constitutional architecture that's supposed to prevent authoritarian consolidation of power. The Constitution assigns Congress, not the president, the power to lay and collect duties and to regulate foreign commerce, and this isn't some ambiguous penumbra or implied power. This is Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers of Congress, spelled out with crystalline clarity by the framers who understood that the power to tax was the most fundamental and dangerous governmental power, and therefore had to rest with the branch most directly accountable to the people. When Trump seizes that power through the manipulation of emergency statutes, he's not just violating congressional prerogatives, he's undermining the entire theory of representative democracy that's supposed to constrain arbitrary government action through democratic accountability. Stanford law professor Michael McConnell, who's representing the challengers in the Supreme Court case, made this point with elegant simplicity when he noted that tariffs are taxes on Americans. The tax bill, it goes to my clients pay the bill. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments, and this cuts through all the rhetorical obfuscation to the core constitutional question. We fought a revolution over the principle of no taxation, without representation. And now we're watching a president impose trillions of dollars in new taxes without any vote from Congress, without any democratic deliberation, without any accountability mechanism, beyond the hope that courts will enforce constitutional limits that this president has shown nothing but contempt for. The historical irony would be darkly amusing if the stakes weren't so catastrophically high. Now let's talk about what the Supreme Court is likely to do with this case, because the oral arguments gave us some sense of where the justices are heading, and the implications are genuinely terrifying for anyone who cares about constitutional governance. Journalists hearing the oral arguments said it appeared likely that the tariffs would be ruled unconstitutional, with both conservative and liberal justices questioning whether IEEPA allowed for the president to set tariffs, and there were some encouraging signs that even conservative justices understand how dangerous this precedent would be. Both Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett raised questions on the non-delegation principle, with Gorsuch saying it would be a one-way ratchet of congressional power to the president if the tariffs were upheld, which is exactly right because once these powers are ceded, they never come back. Congress never successfully reclaims authority it has allowed to drift to the executive branch, but we also saw Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas had said that the court may be treading on presidential power by overruling his tariffs, righting, and this is where the conservative legal movement's supposed commitment to originalism and separation of powers gets exposed as fundamentally hollow when it conflicts with their political preferences. The major questions doctrine should be dispositive here, and the fact that it might not be reveals everything about how politicized the Supreme Court has become under its current conservative supermajority. This same court that struck down the Clean Power Plan and student debt relief and the eviction moratorium, because they supposedly represented unauthorized expansions of executive authority without clear congressional authorization, is now confronted with a far more egregious power grab that involves trillions of dollars and affects every sector of the economy, and we're supposed to believe that somehow this is different because it involves foreign policy and trade. The intellectual incoherence is staggering, the transparent double standard is infuriating, and the potential consequences of the court blessing this power grab are genuinely apocalyptic for constitutional democracy. If Trump can impose trillions in taxes by declaring an emergency based on trade deficits that have existed for decades, then literally any policy priority can be transformed into an emergency justification for unilateral executive action, and Congress becomes an optional advisory body rather than a co-equal branch of government. What makes Van Hollen's intervention so important is that he's connecting these constitutional questions to their material consequences in a way that cuts through the abstractness of legal doctrine and forces us to confront what this actually means for working families. When he talks about families paying higher prices for everyday necessities, when he mocks Trump's tone-deaf comment about kids' allowances, when he points out that the administration itself has acknowledged the inflationary impact of these policies, he's doing the essential work of progressive politics, which is refusing to allow economic policy to be discussed in technocratic terms, divorced from human consequences. These tariffs represent an average per-household cost of $2,400 due to tariffs in 2025, according to analysts at the Yale Budget Lab, and that's real money for families who are already struggling. That's multiple mortgage payments, or months of groceries, or the difference between making rent and facing eviction. The human cost of Trump's trade war is staggering, and it's being borne disproportionately by the working-class voters Trump claims to champion. The economic analysis here is unambiguous, and has been consistent across the ideological spectrum, because you don't need to be a progressive to understand that tariffs are taxes, and that massive tariff increases will raise consumer prices. The Trump tariffs are the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP, 0.47% for 2025, since 1993, and this is happening at the same time Trump is pushing for massive tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, which reveals the profound class dimension of his entire economic project. He's imposing regressive taxes on working families through tariffs, while simultaneously trying to extend and expand tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit the rich, and this is being sold as economic populism, as putting America first, when it's actually just standard Republican plutocracy, wrapped in nationalist rhetoric. The distributional consequences are obscene. With households near the bottom of the income distribution, we'll see a decrease in disposable income that is 2.5 times larger than that experienced by those in the top decile, and this is by design. This is the natural consequence of relying on consumption taxes rather than progressive income taxes to fund government operations. We also need to talk about the complete failure of Trump's stated policy objectives, because even if you accepted the nationalist premises that trade deficits are inherently bad, and that manufacturing job losses to trade are the central economic problem facing America, which are both highly questionable propositions, the tariffs still wouldn't work to achieve those goals. Trump's imposed tariffs will raise $2.1 trillion in revenue over the next decade on a conventional basis, and reduce U.S. GDP by 0.5%, all before foreign retaliation. The unit. So we're making ourselves poorer, we're shrinking the overall economic pie. And for what? Studies of the first Trump trade war found that import tariffs had neither a sizable nor significant effect on U.S. employment in regions with newly protected sectors, and foreign retaliation, by contrast, had clear negative employment impacts, particularly in agriculture. So the promised manufacturing renaissance never materialized, while farmers got devastated by retaliatory tariffs and then had to be bailed out with taxpayer money. This is economic policy, as performance art, designed to create the appearance of toughness and action rather than to actually solve problems or improve people's lives. The inflationary impact is accelerating, as these tariffs work their way through supply chains and businesses exhaust their pre-tariff inventory and are forced to pass costs on to consumers. Through June, U.S. consumers had absorbed 22% of tariff costs, but that share was expected to rise to 67% by October, according to Goldman Sachs economists, and eventually Goldman expects that about 70% of the direct costs will fall on consumers, with that potentially rising to 100% when you include the spillover effects of domestic producers raising their prices because they can charge more when foreign competition is artificially constrained by tariffs. So we're in the early stages of feeling these price increases, the worst is yet to come, and all of this is preventable. All of this is the direct result of policy choices made by an administration that values nationalist symbolism over economic reality. The global implications of Trump's trade war deserve serious attention because this isn't just harming Americans, it's destabilizing the entire international trading system that has underwritten unprecedented global prosperity since World War II. Trump's tariffs threaten to weaken the stability of the global trading system, and we're seeing evidence of this destabilization everywhere you look, with traditional allies being forced to negotiate one-sided deals under threat of crippling tariffs, with global supply chains being disrupted, with investment decisions being put on hold due to massive uncertainty about what the trade environment will look like 6 months or a year from now. Trump's signature policies would foster a future world economy that is more divided, less prosperous, and increasingly unstable, and this plays directly into the hands of authoritarian competitors like China, who would love nothing more than to see America abdicate its leadership role in the global economic order and retreat into reactionary nationalism. The parallel to the 1930s should haunt anyone familiar with economic history, because we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 were passed with similar nationalist rhetoric about protecting American jobs and industries, and they contributed to the collapse of global trade that deepened and prolonged the Great Depression and created the economic conditions that enabled the rise of fascism in Europe. Obviously, the current situation is different in many respects, and historical analogies are always imperfect, but the underlying dynamic of escalating protectionism, retaliatory tariffs, collapsing trade flows, and rising nationalist resentment should terrify anyone who understands how quickly economic instability can metastasize into geopolitical catastrophe. We are playing with fire here. We are gambling with the foundations of the international order that has preserved relative peace and prosperity for 80 years, and we're doing it based on the economic illiteracy and authoritarian impulses of a president who fundamentally doesn't understand or care about the consequences of his actions. Let me bring this back to Van Hollen's central argument, because what he's articulating is that these tariffs are both illegal under current statutory law and unconstitutional under the fundamental structure of American government, and both of those claims are correct, and both demand that the courts intervene to check this executive overreach. When he says he's hoping the Supreme Court will overturn the president's decision, he's not being naive or deferential. He's articulating what should be a baseline expectation, that the judicial branch will enforce constitutional limits on presidential power, even when that means constraining a politically popular president, pursuing policies that resonate with parts of the electorate. The court has a solemn obligation here, not to Trump, not to any partisan agenda, but to the Constitution itself, and to the separation of powers framework that's supposed to prevent exactly this kind of executive aggrandizement. The cost to consumers that Van Hollen highlighted cannot be overstated, because these aren't abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real families facing real hardship because of these policies. When Trump admitted that prices would rise, when he made that comment about kids maybe getting $2 instead of $30, he was revealing the fundamental contempt this administration has for working families who are struggling. What family other than the Trump family can afford to give their kids $30 regularly? Van Hollen asks, And it's a devastating question because it exposes the class bubble Trump inhabits, where $30 is throwaway money, rather than a meaningful sum that might represent hours of labor at minimum wage, or the difference between making the grocery budget stretch through the end of the week. The President of the United States is literally incapable of conceiving economic reality for ordinary Americans, and that incapacity is translating directly into policy that makes their lives harder and more expensive. The administration's decision to lift tariffs on some goods after spending months claiming they were essential for national security also exposes the incoherence and pretextual nature of this entire scheme, as Van Hollen points out. If these are genuine emergency measures necessary to address existential threats to national security, then why are they being adjusted and modified based on political considerations and economic pressure? The answer is obvious, which is that they were never really about national security in the first place. They were always about Trump's personal obsession with trade deficits and his desire to appear tough and decisive, and now that the economic costs are mounting, the administration is trying to have it both ways, maintaining the tariffs for political purposes while carving out exceptions to mitigate the worst economic damage. This is not coherent policy. This is chaos masquerading as strength, and the American people are paying the price. What we need to understand is that this fight over tariffs is inseparable from the broader struggle over the future of American democracy. Because executive power unchecked by meaningful constitutional constraints is executive tyranny, regardless of whether it's being exercised by someone you like or someone you despise. The question before the Supreme Court is whether the president can effectively legislate by declaring emergencies, whether the separation of powers means anything when it comes to presidential action in areas touching on foreign affairs and national security, whether Congress retains any meaningful role in what the Constitution explicitly assigns as congressional prerogatives. These are not technical questions of administrative law. These are fundamental questions about the structure and survival of constitutional democracy, and the court's answer will reverberate through American law and politics for generations. So when you hear Van Hollen say these tariffs are illegal and unconstitutional, understand that he's not engaging in hyperbole or partisan posturing. He's stating what should be an obvious legal conclusion, based on the text and structure of the Constitution, and the plain language and legislative history of the statutes Trump is misusing. When he connects that constitutional violation to rising prices for families, he's doing the essential progressive work of forcing us to confront the human cost of legal abstractions and elite policy failures. When he mocks Trump's comment about kids' allowances, he's highlighting the obscene disconnect between the ruling class and the working families whose lives they're making harder. This is what progressive analysis looks like, connecting constitutional structure to material conditions, refusing to separate law from justice, demanding accountability from those who wield power without democratic legitimacy. The Supreme Court will issue its ruling, and we'll see whether the conservative supermajority has any genuine commitment to the constitutional principles they claim to revere, or whether their supposed textualism and originalism and commitment to separation of powers evaporates when confronted with a Republican president pursuing policies they ideologically support. But regardless of what the court does, this fight will continue because the stakes are too high and the consequences too severe to accept the normalization of presidential authoritarianism disguised as emergency powers. We need to be clear-eyed about what we're witnessing, which is a president systematically dismantling constitutional constraints on executive power while imposing massive costs on working families, and we need to be uncompromising in our resistance because the alternative is acquiescing to the collapse of the constitutional order and the consolidation of authoritarian rule.